Hi, it's really great to be with you today. I'm Margaret O'Mara. I teach history at the University of Washington in Seattle, and I write about the history of the U.S. technology industry. I published a book last year called The Code, which is a history of Silicon Valley from the 1940s to the present. And one of the things that I wanted to do was to put the history of this industry into broader social and political context. And so that's what I want to do today really quickly is seed some ideas that expand the way that we talk about the lack of racial diversity, particularly the underrepresentation of Black people in engineering roles and in managerial roles in tech. That goes beyond the so-called pipeline problem, the fact that which was identified conversation a few years ago about how there's not enough engineers being trained, which has then evolved into the retention problem. Both of which are very real. But I think to understand the question of retention and the question of how we achieve diversity, inclusion, and representation in tech, which is critically important in this sector, not only for in terms of for society, but also for the businesses themselves, is to contextualize them more broadly in history and understand that the reason tech looks the way it does, the reason that we have such a lack of representation, particularly in the C-suite and at the managerial levels, why it is so overwhelmingly white, so overwhelmingly male, and where racial diversity is mostly with South and East Asian managers and executives, but even then, it still overwhelmingly does not reflect America. We need to think bigger and look back. And one of the things that I look in my research is how much Silicon Valley as a place shaped not only the technology industry in the Valley, but more broadly the technology industry worldwide, because this place has become the command and control center of the global technology industry and has this outsized influence on the culture of the companies that are in this space. So Silicon Valley grew where it did in part because it was the place it was. It was an agricultural valley in California. It was an agricultural valley that starting in the 1950s and going forward became heavily suburbanized. And the history of mass suburbanization in the United States is also a history of exclusion, racial exclusion, segregation, a whole host of public programs and private real estate development that was deliberately designed to exclude people of color, and particularly Black people. Unsurprisingly, the South Bay of San Francisco that becomes the Silicon Valley, which in its agricultural era was heavily Latino and Asian American. Those populations don't go away. They get kind of pushed to the margins. And there always has been a Black population in the Valley, a small one, but it has been there. But again, is pushed to the margins as this new suburbanization, overwhelmingly, almost entirely white middle class, begins in the 1950s. So that's one dimension. It's a very white place historically, the capital of tech. A second factor is institutions. What built tech regions like Silicon Valley, what built the technology industry? It's research universities, in particular their engineering programs. Those programs in the 50s and 60s and going forward were almost entirely, in fact, entirely male and almost entirely white. And where you did get racial diversity was often with foreign-born students rather than American-born African Americans and Latinos and others. So you have this overwhelmingly white and male kind of pipeline that's setting up this system. The central institution in in Silicon Valley's history is, of course, Stanford University, which has had a small Black student population, but to this day, Black students are still, as of the time I'm speaking to you, there are faculty and students at Stanford who are trying to persuade the administration to create a Black Studies program, an African American Studies program standalone, because it doesn't even exist as a department. So this is again an institution that by design and by history was very white, was not a place where that has significant and was open to many Black people, and particularly in the engineering divisions. Again, the institutions in the place are really important in understanding how this incredible container of innovation and innovative companies is created. It's also about people. And as I mentioned before, the suburbanization of the 1950s and 60s is, creating these incredible residential communities for white families. And that is again, the people who are migrating to California are overwhelmingly white. There are Black engineers, but they are not in significant numbers among those who are migrating to California to work in the small electronics and aerospace industries. And so the early startup companies, this is Fairchild Semiconductor, which is considered like the grandfather of all tech startups, this legendary company whose founders include the founders of some of the major venture capital and technology companies in the Valley going forward, including the co-founders of Intel, the co-founder of Kleiner Perkins, and other companies. As you can see, this is a very racially stratified and gendered company. You have white men at the top in their white shirts, and you have women, white middle-class women, who are in the background of this picture on the production line building the electronic equipment. And so this dimension is, of course, this is 1960. That's what America was like in 1960, right? So why is this still operational today? It's important today because the magic of Silicon Valley is its networks, is the connections from one generation of technologists to the other. So the first generation of technologists, they become the venture capitalists of the next. They are betting on the winners of the next generation. So you have the semiconductor microchip generation of the 1960s. They have their big exits. Some of them become investors and venture capitalists. They become investors in companies of the personal computer generation, like Apple. That personal computer generation of the late 70s and early 80s, when they have their big exits, they become the investors in the dot-com generation. Here's Netscape, which is a prime example of a company that was built by this Silicon Valley network, whose venture investors were Kleiner Perkins and these veterans of these earlier generations of tech, where you had a young entrepreneur, Mark Andreessen, who's the kid in the yellow tie, sitting on one computer, who was brought in with adult supervision, Jim Clark, this guy sitting on the other computer from an older generation, who's bringing his managerial organizational expertise. Now, we all know that these networks of mentorship are critically important in building any sort of business, but recognizing that the racial and gender makeup of that network and the informal nature of these ties, where people are looking for investments that they think are good bets and that have leadership that is a good bet. And they're looking for what one venture capitalist infamously slipped up and called pattern recognition, where you're looking for a guy in a hoodie, a kind of geeky guy who looks like the person who ran a successful company before. So really, the story about tech is about opportunity. Now we have this incredibly bifurcated landscape in tech, in Silicon Valley and beyond, where you have, on the one hand, people who work at Google, who get to ride their bikes around campus all day when they're not working from home, who have incredibly privileged positions. And then you have, on the other hand, the working class of the Valley that has literally been physically pushed out, where you have people boarding buses in the Central Valley of California to go to work in the Tesla factory, which is just in the East Bay, Elon Musk's Tesla factory, where you have a working class that's been completely displaced because of housing costs and because a lack of opportunity to get into those more privileged places in tech. I talk about more of this history in my book, and this is just a bit of tapping into it, but I think it's really important to recognize the racial discrimination that is embedded in so much of the pieces of the tech ecosystem. When we recognize them, then we know how to open them up. When we recognize the historical truths, then we get to go to work and recognize this is not just about an engineering pipeline problem. It is not only a retention problem, but it has to do with the whole ecosystem of tech, and recognizing that it is not a meritocracy. It is actually a place where close personal connections, and yes, people's unconscious and conscious biases have shaped opportunity. And thinking about diversity and inclusion going forward, we have this history can be a tool and a really critical tool in building a more inclusive tech world. And I wish you guys all the luck in doing that. Thank you.